In the last section, we took a look at some of the different features of fat arrow functions. So the number one rule of thumb is that if we want to, we could just continue using function keyword all the time if we want. If we want to ever, we could start using the fat arrow function by leaving off that function keyword and using a fat arrow instead. So let's continue talking about some of the other features of fat arrow functions. I'm going to write a new function here, and I'm going to call it double, because its sole purpose is to just double a number. So let's say we have a number. I'm going to return 2 times that number, like so. So then if I double 8, I get back, presumably, 16. So let's refactor this over to using fat arrow syntax. Step number 1 is to remove the function keyword. So I'll remove it. And then on the other side of the argument list, I'll put on my fat arrow. And boom, everything is working again as I expect. Now step number 2, I have a single JavaScript expression in the function's body, which means I can remove the return keyword and remove the curly braces as well. And now I've got a single line here. So now the second feature of fat arrow functions I want to mention that's really important is that if we have a single argument, so a single argument, just one right here, we can also omit the parens around it. And so this is as compact an expression as we can possibly make right here using fat arrow functions. So because we had a single argument, I can drop off the parentheses around it. Now, keep in mind that if I have more than one argument, what happens there? Let's say that I add on another argument on here. I'm going to double 2 things. So we'll have number 1 and number 2. And then the result will be 2 times number 1 and 2 times number 2. So now in this case, I have 2 separate arguments. And if I start dropping off the parens, I'm going to get a big error message down here of, hey, unexpected token. So we can only omit the parentheses when we have a single argument. The other kind of edge case I want to throw out there is that if we ever have a function with no arguments, so let's say we're just down to this, double doesn't take anything at all, and we're just always going to return the number 2 here. In this case, if I don't have any arguments at all, I still have to put down the parentheses. So basically, I can't do that. We're going to get unexpected token in there. So the general rule of thumb here is if I have a single argument, I can drop off the parentheses. So if I go back to say doubling 4, I can drop off the parentheses and everyone is happy. There we go. Okay. The only other last tiny little piece I want to mention here, because it trips me up all the time as well, is if I go down to that compact syntax of something like this, where I'm not using any curly braces, I do not put a parenthesis, or excuse me, a semicolon after my body, the body of my function. So if I put a semicolon inside of here, it's going to think that it's an unexpected token. So I do not use a semicolon after the function body, which would be the 2 times the number here. Now I can certainly place it outside if I so chose, I just cannot place it inside. So that's just a very small distinction there. In practice, I've found that arrow functions are fantastic for cleaning up my code base, but when you're first getting used to them, they're also kind of annoying because of all these little kind of idiosyncrasies about their syntax. You have to keep in mind the rule of, okay, I can omit the curly braces when there's a single expression, and I can omit the parentheses when there's a single argument. And so they sound like simple rules, as I'm clearly mentioning them to you right now, but when you actually sit down and try to write some code of your own, I've found that it gets a little bit more complicated to keep these rules in mind. Okay, so let's do one more example here and look at how we might use the fat arrows in practice. We will talk about exactly what they solve in the next section, but I just want to show you one more quick refactor here. So let's say that I've got an array of numbers, and we're going to have 1, 2, and 3, and then I want to map over this array, and I want to double each number in the array. So I want to produce an array of 2, 4, and 6. So I'll use my map helper again. I'll take an argument of a number, and then inside of here, I'll return 2 times the number. And so this would be a much more canonical use, or kind of where I would expect to use a fat arrow function, as opposed to kind of defining a function in line and assigning it to a variable. So with our map function here, we've got a lot of extra characters in here. We've got the big function keyword, We got the parens, the curly braces, all this, the return keyword, all this different stuff for just doubling a number. And so we're going to see this, a very common theme here with ES6 is just dropping off as many characters as we possibly can with the code we write. So we're going to write code that does something the exact same, but we're just going to have fewer characters to do it. So let's refactor this to use a fat arrow function. First, I'm going to recognize that I have a single JavaScript expression inside of the function body. And that means I can drop off the return keyword and the curly braces. Next, I have a function keyword in here that I do not need anymore. So I'm going to delete the function keyword and instead put a fat arrow function after the argument list. And then finally, I'm going to notice that my function here has a single argument, so I can drop off the parentheses around the argument. And just like that, I'm left with a very compact expression right here. This is as compact as it gets. Totally tiny, absolutely equivalent to the to using a function, the long form function that we had just before, but way less code. And in particular, to kind of draw back our discussion to everything we were talking about with for loops before, compare this logic right here, compare everything I have right here to the code that we had to write to make something equivalent with the for loop. It was so many characters, so much code, so much boilerplate to do this with the for loop. And so again, I got to circle back and make the point here to say when we're using these array helpers, we end up with amazingly concise code. Okay. So I feel like I've probably been harping on about the specifics of fat arrow functions a lot right now. So let's continue in the next section and talk about what they really solve, okay? Because there's one last feature of fat arrow functions that are really fantastic, very useful. So let's talk about that in the next section.